The radio crackled with static as Lieutenant Commander Marcus, Reaper, Hayes pressed his back against the crumbling concrete wall, Taliban rounds chipping away at his cover. His SEAL team had been pinned down for 3 hours in the bombed-out compound 12 clicks north of Kandahar, their extraction helicopter nothing more than twisted metal and smoke billowing into the Afghan sky. The mission had gone sideways fast. What should have been a simple intelligence grab had turned into a nightmare when they'd walked into a carefully orchestrated ambush. "Control, this is Viper 6, Hayes spoke into his radio, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We need immediate air support. Repeat, immediate air support. We've got approximately 40 hostiles in fortified positions, RPGs, and we're running low on ammunition." The response came back with the kind of clinical detachment that made Hayes's blood run cold. "Viper 6, be advised, no rotary wing assets available. Fixed wing support is 40 minutes out. Suggest you find alternative extraction." Hayes looked across at his team medic, Petty Officer Rodriguez, who was applying pressure to Sergeant Mitchell's leg wound. The youngest member of their unit, Petty Officer Jackson, was methodically counting his remaining magazines with the kind of focus that came from knowing every bullet might be the difference between going home and becoming a statistic. "Alternative extraction," Hayes muttered under his breath. "Copy that, Control. Viper 6 will hold position and await support." But even as he said the words, Hayes knew the math. 40 minutes was a lifetime in a firefight, and the Taliban fighters surrounding their position weren't exactly known for their patience. The compound offered decent cover, but they were surrounded on 3 sides with a sheer drop behind them, a killing field that would make any assault a suicide run for either side. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty courtyard where spent brass casings caught the light like deadly confetti. Hayes could hear the enemy voices coordinating their next move, the distinctive whistle of an incoming mortar sending his team scrambling for deeper cover. The explosion showered them with debris and left his ears ringing. That's when the radio came alive, with a transmission that would change everything. Any station, this is Ghost Rider 77. I've got eyes on multiple muzzle flashes and a lot of very unhappy people down there. Somebody want to tell me what kind of party you're having?" The voice was calm, almost conversational, with the kind of understated confidence that only came from serious flight hours. But there was something else, something that made Hayes pause despite the incoming fire. The voice belonged to a woman. "Ghost Rider 77, this is Viper 6. We're pinned down and need immediate close air support. What's your platform?" "Viper 6, Ghost Rider 77. I'm flying a C-130 Hercules, and before you ask, yes, I know what you're thinking." Hayes keyed his radio, confusion cutting through his tactical focus. A cargo plane, against a fortified enemy position. The idea was so absurd it bordered on comedy, and under different circumstances, he might have laughed. Instead, he found himself staring up at the empty sky, wondering if their salvation might come from the most unlikely source imaginable. The Taliban mortar teams were finding their range now, each explosion walking closer to their position. Hayes could see Rodriguez shaking his head over Mitchell's wound. They needed medical evacuation, and they needed it soon. Jackson was down to his last 2 magazines, and Hayes himself wasn't far behind. "Ghost Rider 77, what kind of ordnance are you carrying?" Hayes asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "That's where it gets interesting, Viper 6. I'm not carrying ordnance at all, but I've got something better. I've got an idea that's either going to save your lives or get us all killed. Probably both." The static-filled pause stretched longer than Hayes would have liked, punctuated by the distant sound of AK-47 fire and shouted commands in Pashto. He could almost hear his team holding their breath, waiting for whatever insane plan was about to unfold over their radio frequency. "Explain your intent, Ghost Rider." "Simple, Viper 6. I'm going to land this bird right in your backyard and give you a ride home. Hope you don't mind flying cargo class. Captain Alexandra Ghost Petrov had been flying military transport aircraft for 8 years, but she'd never attempted anything remotely close to what she was proposing. The idea had formed in her mind the moment she'd spotted the muzzle flashes from 30,000 feet, a desperate solution born from equal parts tactical analysis and pure stubbornness. Her C-130 Hercules wasn't designed for combat landings in hot zones, but Ghost had learned long ago that military aircraft could be pushed far beyond their intended specifications when lives hung in the balance. Ghost Rider 77, say again, Hayes's voice crackled over the radio. Did you just say you're planning to land a C-130 in an active combat zone? That's affirmative, Viper 6. I've been studying your position on thermal imaging, and there's a stretch of relatively flat ground about 200 meters east of your current location. It's not exactly a runway, but I've landed on worse. Ghost's loadmaster, Technical Sergeant Mike Torres, was already moving through the cargo bay, securing loose equipment and preparing for what would either be the most unconventional rescue in special operations history or a spectacular failure that would be studied in military academies for decades to come. He'd flown with Ghost on 47 missions over 2 deployments, and he'd learned to trust her judgment even when it seemed to defy logic. Ghost, you realize what you're proposing is tactically insane, Torres said over the intercom, though his tone carried more admiration than concern. That's what makes it perfect, Ghost replied, her hands steady on the controls as she began her descent. The enemy expects air support to come in the form of fighter jets or attack helicopters. They've probably got RPGs positioned for those threats. Nobody positions anti-aircraft weapons to engage cargo planes because cargo planes don't land in combat zones. The Hercules dropped through scattered clouds, its 4 turboprop engines creating a distinctive sound that would soon echo off the surrounding mountains. Ghost had plotted her approach to minimize exposure time while maximizing the element of surprise. The Taliban fighters would hear her coming, but by the time they understood what was happening, it would be too late to effectively reposition their weapons. Through her cockpit window, Ghost could see the compound where the SEALs were trapped, surrounded by enemy positions that revealed themselves through muzzle flashes and movement. The tactical picture was grim. Hayes and his team were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of options. But Ghost had faced impossible odds before, and she'd learned that sometimes the most desperate situations called for the most unconventional solutions. Her call sign had been earned during her first deployment, when she'd successfully delivered supplies to a forward operating base that was supposedly impossible to reach by air. The ground crews had started calling her Ghost after she'd somehow materialized out of a sandstorm with medical supplies and ammunition that had saved 37 soldiers. The name had stuck, and over the years, it had become synonymous with missions that existed somewhere between brilliant and suicidal. All stations, Ghost transmitted on the common frequency. This is Ghost Rider 77 beginning combat approach. I need that landing zone cleared of hostile personnel in 60 seconds. Light 'em up and keep their heads down. Hayes's response was immediate. Ghost Rider, we'll lay down suppressing fire, but understand, we're low on ammunition and completely surrounded. This is going to be a hot landing zone. Copy that, Viper 6. It wouldn't be any fun if it were easy. The irony wasn't lost on Ghost that her most challenging mission would involve landing rather than flying. But as she lined up her approach and felt the familiar vibration of the Hercules responding to her commands, she found herself smiling behind her oxygen mask. This was exactly the kind of impossible situation that had drawn her to military aviation in the first place. The compound grew larger in her windscreen, and Ghost could see the tactical situation unfolding in real time. The SEALs were exactly where Hayes had reported, using the limited cover available while surrounded by enemy positions that formed an almost perfect killing field. What she was about to attempt would either be remembered as a brilliant rescue or a costly mistake, but Ghost had long ago made peace with those kinds of stakes. Her radio crackled with Hayes's voice. "Ghost Rider 77, we've got movement on the eastern perimeter. Multiple RPG teams repositioning. They know you're coming." "Let them reposition," Ghost replied, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "By the time they figure out where I'm going to land, I'll already be there." Ghost's approach was a masterclass in tactical aviation that would be studied for years to come. She brought the massive C-130 in low and fast, using the natural terrain to mask her profile until the last possible moment. The Hercules dropped out of the mountain shadows like a mechanical thunderbird, its engine screaming as Ghost adjusted power and angle to compensate for the uneven ground that would serve as her improvised runway. The Taliban fighters scrambled to reposition their weapons, but their RPG teams had been positioned to engage helicopters and fast movers, aircraft that followed predictable attack patterns and vulnerable approach vectors. Nobody had trained them to engage a cargo plane attempting a combat landing, because such a maneuver had never been attempted in modern warfare. Torres had strapped himself into the jump seat behind Ghost's position, his experienced eyes scanning the instruments and calling out critical information. "Airspeed 140 and decreasing. Altitude 200 feet. Ground proximity radar is screaming, but we're looking good for touchdown." "Roger that," Ghost replied, her hands moving with practiced precision across the controls. The Hercules was responding beautifully, its robust design proving ideal for the kind of abuse she was subjecting it to. The landing zone rushed toward them at what seemed like impossible speed, marked by the muzzle flashes of the SEALs covering fire and the answering bursts from Taliban positions. Hayes watched from his position behind the concrete wall as the impossible became reality. The C-130 materialized out of the afternoon sky like something from a fever dream, its massive bulk somehow graceful as Ghost lined up her approach. The sound of the engines overwhelmed the crack of small arms fire, creating a momentary pause in the battle as both sides tried to process what they were witnessing. "Jesus Christ," Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible over the approaching aircraft. "She's actually going to do it." Rodriguez looked up from Mitchell's wound long enough to see the Hercules flare for landing, its main gear extending as Ghost prepared for touchdown. "I've seen a lot of crazy stuff in my career," he said, "but this is going to be one for the books." The moment the C-130's wheels touched the improvised runway, Ghost was already executing the next phase of her plan. She kept the engines spooled up while Torres dropped the rear cargo ramp, creating an opening that the SEALs could use for rapid boarding. The aircraft's momentum carried it forward even as Ghost applied reverse thrust, using every available foot of ground to maximize their loading time. "Viper 6, your taxi is here," Ghost transmitted. "I can hold this position for approximately 90 seconds before we start taking effective fire. Suggest you move quickly." Hayes was already in motion, coordinating his team's movement with the kind of precision that came from years of training and combat experience. "Mitchell, you're first. Rodriguez, help him to the aircraft. Jackson, provide covering fire. Move." The SEALs bounded across the open ground in a tactical formation that balanced speed with security. Mitchell, despite his leg wound, managed to keep up with Rodriguez's support, while Jackson laid down precise bursts of covering fire that kept the Taliban fighters' heads down. Hayes brought up the rear, his eyes constantly scanning for threats as his team approached their unlikely salvation. The Taliban response was swift but poorly coordinated. Several fighters broke from cover to engage the stationary aircraft, but they were met by devastating fire from both the SEALs and Torres, who had positioned himself at the cargo door with an M240 machine gun. The sound of the C-130's engines made communication difficult, but the tactical picture was clear. They had seconds, not minutes, to complete the extraction. Ghost felt the Hercules shudder as small arms rounds impacted the fuselage. But the aircraft's robust construction absorbed the damage without compromising flight systems. Her biggest concern was an RPG hit to the engines or fuel tanks, but the Taliban fighters seemed as confused by her unorthodox tactics as they were desperate to prevent her escape. 30 seconds to departure, Ghost announced over the radio. If you're not on board by then, you're walking home. Hayes dove through the cargo door just as Torres pulled the ramp closed, the mechanical whine of hydraulics barely audible over the engine noise. Ghost didn't wait for confirmation. She pushed the throttles forward and began her takeoff roll before the ramp had fully closed, using every available foot of ground as the C-130 accelerated toward what she hoped would be sufficient flying speed. The Hercules lifted off with mere feet to spare, clearing the compound's outer wall by a margin that would have terrified any pilot who wasn't named Ghost Petrov. Behind them, the Taliban fighters continued firing at their departing aircraft, but their rounds fell harmlessly short as Ghost climbed rapidly toward the safety of altitude. In the cargo bay, Hayes found himself sprawled on the deck next to his team, all of them breathing hard and staring at each other with the kind of disbelief that came from surviving something that should have killed them. Mitchell's wound was already being treated by the aircraft's medical kit, while Jackson was methodically checking his gear with the obsessive attention to detail that marked professional soldiers. "Viper 6, this is Ghost Rider 77, came the voice over the intercom. "Welcome aboard Air Ghost. We'll have you back to base in approximately 45 minutes. Coffee service will begin once we reach cruising altitude." Hayes keyed his radio, his voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and amazement. "Ghost Rider 77, that was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever witnessed. How do we thank you for something like that?" There was a pause before Ghost responded, and Hayes could hear the smile in her voice. "Just doing my job, Viper 6, though I'll admit that was a first for me too." Torres appeared from the cockpit, his face showing the kind of exhilaration that came from participating in something unprecedented. "Gentlemen, you just witnessed military aviation history. That landing and takeoff sequence will be talked about for the next 50 years. But even as the adrenaline began to fade and the reality of their rescue settled in, Hayes found himself thinking about the pilot who had just saved their lives. There was something about Ghost's voice, something that suggested this kind of impossible mission was just another day at the office for her. He wondered what kind of person chose to fly cargo planes into combat zones, and what had shaped her into the kind of pilot who could execute maneuvers that existed somewhere between brilliant and insane. The C-130 climbed steadily toward its cruising altitude, leaving behind the compound where 4 special operations warriors had faced impossible odds and found salvation in the most unlikely form imaginable. But their rescue was just the beginning of a story that would soon become legend throughout the military aviation community. Word of Ghost's rescue mission spread through the special operations community with the speed that only truly extraordinary stories achieve. Within hours of their return to base, Hayes found himself fielding questions from officers who wanted to understand exactly how a cargo pilot had executed what was being called the most audacious rescue in modern military history. But every time someone asked about the pilot herself, Hayes realized he knew almost nothing about the woman who had risked everything to save his team. The official after-action report would be classified at the highest levels, but the story itself had already taken on a life of its own. Transport pilots who had previously been relegated to the unglamorous role of bus drivers suddenly found themselves looking at their aircraft with new appreciation. Maybe hauling cargo and personnel wasn't as mundane as they'd thought. Maybe there were ways to push their aircraft beyond conventional limitations when the situation demanded it. Captain Alexandra Petrov, meanwhile, was trying to process what she had just accomplished. The landing had been challenging, but not impossible. She trained for short field operations throughout her career, and the Hercules was designed for rough field landings. The takeoff had been more concerning, since she'd been operating at the very edge of the aircraft's performance envelope with a combat load and minimal runway distance. But as she flew toward their home base, Ghost found herself thinking not about the technical aspects of what she'd just accomplished, but about the 4 men in her cargo bay who were alive because she'd been willing to attempt something that had never been done before. That feeling, the knowledge that her skills and her aircraft had made the difference between life and death for fellow service members, was exactly why she'd chosen military aviation over the airlines. Her career had been marked by a series of unconventional assignments and challenging missions, but nothing quite like this. Ghost had always been drawn to the kind of flying that pushed boundaries and challenged assumptions. Transport aviation offered unique opportunities for creative problem-solving, but most of her colleagues seemed content with routine cargo runs and predictable flight schedules. The radio crackled with their base calling for a position report, and Ghost responded with the kind of professional precision that had become second nature after thousands of flight hours. But as she coordinated their approach and landing, she was already thinking about the debriefing that awaited them and the questions that would inevitably follow. Tours emerged from the cargo bay with an update on their passengers. The wounded guy, Mitchell, is stable and in good spirits. The team leader wants to buy you dinner when we get back. All of them are asking questions about how you learned to fly like that. Tell them I had a good teacher, Ghost replied, though she didn't elaborate on who that teacher had been or what lessons had shaped her into the pilot she'd become. The truth was more complex than she was willing to discuss over the radio. Ghost's unconventional approach to aviation had been forged through years of challenging assignments and mentors who had taught her that military aircraft were capable of far more than their technical specifications suggested. She'd learned early in her career that the most valuable skill a pilot could develop was the ability to think beyond conventional limitations and find solutions that others might dismiss as impossible. As they approached their home base, Ghost could see other aircraft on the flight line, fighters, helicopters, and transport planes that represented the full spectrum of military aviation. Each aircraft had its role, its mission, and its limitations. But Ghost had just proven that those limitations were often more psychological than technical, and that sometimes the most effective solution was the one that nobody expected. The tower cleared them for landing, and Ghost brought the Hercules down with the same precision she demonstrated in combat. But as she taxied toward the parking area, she could see that word of their mission had already spread. Ground crews, maintenance personnel, and other pilots had gathered to witness the return of the C-130 that had just rewritten the rules of combat aviation. Hayes and his team would go on to complete their deployment and return home to families who would never fully understand how close they'd come to not coming home at all. But they would carry with them the memory of a pilot who had appeared out of nowhere when all hope seemed lost, and they would tell their story to anyone who would listen. The impact of Ghost's mission extended far beyond the immediate rescue of 4 special operations personnel. Within weeks, transport pilot training programs were being revised to include modules on combat landing techniques and unconventional tactical employment. Aircraft that had been considered purely logistical assets were suddenly being evaluated for their potential in direct combat support roles. But perhaps more importantly, the rescue had demonstrated something that the military aviation community had been slow to acknowledge: that courage, skill, and innovation could come from any platform, any mission, and any pilot willing to push beyond the boundaries of conventional thinking. Ghost Petrov had not only saved 4 lives, she had fundamentally changed how the military thought about transport aviation and the capabilities of the pilots who flew those missions. The debriefing took place in a secure conference room that smelled of stale coffee and bureaucracy. Ghost sat at one end of a polished table, facing a panel of senior officers whose rank insignia represented more combined flight experience than most wings accumulated in a decade. The questions came in waves, each probing a different aspect of her decision-making process and execution. "Captain Petrov," began Colonel James Morrison, the wing commander whose weathered face showed the accumulated stress of 23 years in military aviation, "walk us through your tactical assessment when you first received the distress call." Ghost straightened in her chair, her voice clear and professional. "Sir, the situation was straightforward. 4 personnel pinned down by superior numbers with no conventional rescue assets available. The enemy had positioned themselves to defend against helicopter extraction and close air support, but their placement suggested they hadn't considered the possibility of a fixed-wing landing. And that assessment led you to conclude that a C-130 combat landing was feasible." "Not feasible, sir, necessary. The mathematics were simple. Conventional rescue would take 40 minutes minimum, and the ground element didn't have 40 minutes. Unconventional rescue could be executed immediately, with the primary risk falling on myself and my crew rather than the ground personnel." Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, the operations group commander, leaned forward with the kind of intense focus that suggested she was already thinking about how to incorporate Ghost's techniques into standard training. "Captain, you executed maneuvers that aren't taught in any flight school. Where did you develop those capabilities?" Ghost paused, considering her answer carefully. The truth was that her unconventional flying skills had been developed through years of pushing boundaries and working with mentors who understood that military aviation sometimes demanded solutions that existed outside official doctrine. But she also knew that the officers questioning her were looking for something they could quantify, analyze, and potentially replicate. "Ma'am, I've been fortunate to work with pilots who emphasized adaptability and creative problem-solving. Transport aviation offers unique opportunities to develop skills that aren't necessarily part of formal training programs. Every challenging landing, every difficult cargo drop, every mission that pushes the aircraft's envelope contributes to a pilot's ability to handle unusual situations." What Ghost didn't mention was her grandfather, Colonel Viktor Petrov, a Soviet transport pilot who had flown supply missions during the siege of Stalingrad, and had taught his granddaughter that aircraft were limited more by imagination than engineering. He had died when Ghost was 12, but his lessons about pushing beyond conventional limitations had shaped her approach to flying in ways that no military training program could replicate. Major Rodriguez, the intelligence officer, consulted his notes before asking, "Captain, how did you assess the enemy's anti-aircraft capabilities during your approach?" "Sir, the thermal imaging showed RPG positions oriented toward traditional helicopter approaches and high-speed attack runs. Their placement indicated they were prepared for conventional threats, but hadn't positioned weapons to engage a cargo aircraft attempting a landing approach. By the time they recognized what was happening and tried to reposition, we were already committed to landing." The questions continued for another hour, covering everything from aircraft performance parameters to risk assessment methodologies. But Ghost could sense that something else was happening in this debriefing. The officers weren't just trying to understand what she had done. They were trying to understand who she was and whether her capabilities could be taught to other pilots. Colonel Morrison finally closed his folder and looked directly at Ghost. "Captain Petrov, what you accomplished yesterday has never been attempted in modern warfare. The tactical implications are significant, and we're going to be spending considerable time analyzing your methods. But I want to ask you a more personal question. What drives you to attempt missions that most pilots would consider impossible?" Ghost considered the question, knowing that her answer would likely influence how her career developed from this point forward. She thought about her grandfather's stories, about the transport pilots who had flown impossible missions, because someone's life depended on their willingness to push beyond safe limitations. "Sir, I became a military pilot because I wanted to make a difference. Transport aviation doesn't usually offer the same opportunities for direct impact as fighter or attack aircraft, but every mission has the potential to be critical for someone on the ground. Yesterday, 4 operators needed extraction, and I had an aircraft capable of providing that extraction. The fact that it hadn't been done before was less important than the fact that it could be done. Colonel Morrison nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that Ghost had given exactly the answer he'd hoped to hear. "Captain, we're recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. More importantly, we're assigning you to a special projects team that will be developing new tactical employment concepts for transport aircraft. Your mission yesterday opened up possibilities that we're only beginning to understand." As Ghost left the debriefing, she found Tors waiting in the hallway with the kind of grin that suggested he knew exactly how the questioning had gone. "So, Ghost, I'm guessing we're not going back to routine cargo runs anytime soon." "Probably not," she replied, "though I have a feeling things are about to get very interesting." What neither of them realized was that Ghost's rescue mission had already begun to influence military thinking at levels far above their wing headquarters. Pentagon analysts were reviewing the tactical footage and asking fundamental questions about how transport aircraft might be employed in direct combat roles. Allied nations were requesting briefings on the techniques Ghost had demonstrated. Military contractors were beginning preliminary design work on transport aircraft, specifically configured for combat landing operations. But perhaps most importantly, young pilots throughout the military were hearing Ghost's story and beginning to think differently about the boundaries of their own capabilities. The pilot who had been willing to attempt the impossible had demonstrated that innovation and courage could come from anywhere, and that the most effective solutions were sometimes the ones that nobody expected. 3 weeks after the rescue, Ghost found herself standing before a different kind of audience. The Special Operations Command auditorium was filled with personnel from every branch of the military: Rangers, SEALs, Air Force Special Tactics Teams, Marine Force Reconnaissance, and others whose missions routinely involved operating at the extremes of military capability. They had gathered to hear firsthand from the pilot who had rewritten the rules of combat aviation. Hayes sat in the front row, his presence serving as a living reminder of why Ghost's mission had mattered. He had insisted on introducing her, despite his own discomfort with public speaking. When he stepped to the podium, the auditorium fell silent with the kind of respect that was reserved for warriors who had earned their credibility through action rather than rank. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, his voice carrying the authority that came from leading men in combat, "3 weeks ago, my team found ourselves in a situation that should have ended very differently than it did. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. Conventional wisdom said we were dead men walking, but conventional wisdom doesn't account for pilots like Captain Alexandra Petrov." He gestured toward Ghost, who stood beside the podium in her dress uniform, her ribbons and wings catching the auditorium lights. What Captain Petrov accomplished that day wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a demonstration that the only limitations in military operations are the ones we accept in our own minds. She saw 4 operators who needed help, and she found a way to provide that help using methods that had never been attempted in modern warfare. The applause was immediate and sustained, but Ghost could see in the faces of her audience something more valuable than appreciation. She could see the kind of professional respect that was earned through demonstrated competence under pressure. These were operators who understood the difference between theoretical courage and the real thing, and they recognized both in what she had accomplished. When Ghost stepped to the podium, she found herself facing an audience that represented the finest military personnel in the world. They had come to hear her story, but more importantly, they had come to understand how she had identified a solution that nobody else had considered. "The mission you've heard about began with a fundamental question," Ghost began, her voice clear and confident. "How do you extract personnel from a position where conventional extraction is impossible?" The answer, it turned out, was to stop thinking conventionally. She clicked to her first slide, which showed a satellite image of the compound where Hayes's team had been trapped. The enemy had positioned themselves to defend against the threats they expected, helicopters flying predictable patterns, fighter aircraft following established attack profiles. They had not considered the possibility that the rescue would come from a cargo plane, attempting a landing that violated every principle of safe aviation. Ghost walked through her tactical analysis step by step, explaining how she had identified the enemy's blind spots and exploited them using aircraft performance characteristics that most pilots would never explore. But as she spoke, she could sense that her audience was absorbing something more fundamental than tactical techniques. They were learning to think beyond the boundaries of conventional solutions. The C-130 Hercules wasn't designed for combat landings in hot zones, Ghost continued. But aircraft are capable of far more than their specifications suggest when the situation demands it, and the pilot is willing to accept calculated risks. The key word is calculated. What I attempted was dangerous, but it wasn't reckless. Every aspect of the mission was planned and executed based on careful analysis of the tactical situation and aircraft capabilities. She clicked to a technical diagram showing her approach profile and the factors that had made the landing possible. Success depended on understanding not just what the aircraft could do, but what the enemy expected us to do. By operating outside their tactical assumptions, we achieved complete surprise and executed the mission before they could effectively respond. The questions from the audience revealed the depth of their professional interest. These were operators who understood that innovation often meant the difference between mission success and mission failure, and they wanted to understand how Ghost's methods might apply to their own challenges. A Navy SEAL commander raised his hand. "Captain, how do you develop the confidence to attempt maneuvers that haven't been proven in combat?" Ghost considered the question carefully. "Sir, confidence comes from preparation and understanding your capabilities. I didn't wake up that morning planning to attempt a combat landing, but I had spent years developing the skills that made it possible when the situation demanded it. Every challenging mission, every difficult landing, every time you push your aircraft's envelope contributes to your ability to handle truly exceptional circumstances." A Marine colonel followed up. "What would you say to pilots who might be inspired by your example but lack the experience to attempt similar missions?" "I'd say that every pilot needs to continuously expand their capabilities, but within the bounds of their experience level. The mission I flew was built on thousands of hours of experience with short-field landings, rough terrain operations, and emergency procedures. You don't develop those capabilities overnight, and you shouldn't attempt advanced techniques without proper preparation." As the briefing concluded and Ghost answered the last questions, she realized that something significant had happened in this auditorium. The story of her rescue mission had evolved beyond a single incident into something larger, a demonstration that military effectiveness often depended on the willingness to think creatively and act decisively when conventional solutions proved inadequate. The applause as she left the stage carried a different quality than what she had received at the beginning. This wasn't just appreciation for an extraordinary mission. It was recognition from the special operations community that Ghost Petrov represented something important about American military capability. She was living proof that innovation, skill, and courage could emerge from any platform and any mission when the situation demanded it. 6 months later, Ghost found herself at Edwards Air Force Base, working with a team of test pilots and engineers who were developing new tactical employment concepts for transport aircraft. The project, officially designated Adaptive Mobility Operations, was exploring ways to push cargo planes beyond their traditional limitations and employ them in direct combat support roles. The test aircraft was a modified C-130J, equipped with enhanced defensive systems, improved short-field landing capabilities, and digital flight controls that would allow pilots to execute maneuvers at the very edge of the aircraft's performance envelope. Ghost had been selected as the primary test pilot, a role that would require her to systematically explore and document techniques that had previously existed only in emergency situations. The goal, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the program's technical director, is to develop standardized procedures for what you accomplished in Afghanistan. We want to understand the parameters, the limitations, and the training requirements for combat landing operations. Ghost nodded as she reviewed the test plan. The systematic approach was necessary. Her rescue mission had been successful, but it had also been unrepeatable in its specifics. Every tactical situation would present different challenges, different opportunities, and different risks. The test program would need to explore all of those variables and develop procedures that other pilots could learn and execute safely. The first phase of testing focused on short-field landing techniques under simulated combat conditions. Ghost worked with a team of engineers to document exactly how she had calculated approach angles, landing speeds, and ground roll distances during her rescue mission. What had been intuitive decision-making in combat was being translated into mathematical models and standardized procedures. The interesting thing, Torres observed as he watched Ghost practice emergency landing techniques, is that you're basically teaching other pilots to think like you. That's not exactly something you can put in a manual. He was right, of course. The technical aspects of combat landing could be taught and practiced, but the decision-making process that had led Ghost to attempt the rescue in the first place was more difficult to quantify. Military effectiveness often depended on individuals who were willing to push beyond safe limitations when the situation demanded it, but that willingness couldn't be programmed or mandated. The test flights revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of Ghost's techniques. Under controlled conditions, experienced pilots could learn to execute combat landings with acceptable risk levels. But the missions also demonstrated that success depended heavily on pilot experience, aircraft condition, and tactical circumstances that might not be replicable in actual combat. What we're learning, Dr. Walsh explained during a progress review, is that Captain Petrov's rescue mission represented the convergence of exceptional pilot skill, ideal tactical conditions, and aircraft performance at the very edge of design specifications. We can teach the techniques, but we can't guarantee the same success rate under different circumstances. Ghost understood the implications. The test program would produce new capabilities and training procedures, but it would also establish parameters for when those capabilities should and shouldn't be employed. Not every transport pilot would be able to execute combat landings, and not every tactical situation would justify the risks involved. But perhaps more importantly, the program was demonstrating that military aviation could benefit from systematic exploration of unconventional techniques. Too often, aircraft were employed within narrow parameters that reflected peacetime safety considerations rather than wartime effectiveness requirements. Ghost's mission had shown that those parameters could be expanded when the situation justified the risks. As the test program continued, Ghost found herself thinking about the broader implications of what they were accomplishing. The techniques they were developing might save lives in future conflicts, but they were also changing how the military thought about transport aviation and the capabilities of the pilots who flew those missions. The young pilot who had joined the Air Force to fly fighters and had ended up in cargo planes was discovering that transport aviation offered its own opportunities for innovation and impact. The missions might be different from what she had originally envisioned, but the sense of purpose and the potential to make a difference were exactly what she had sought when she first put on a military uniform. Her grandfather would have understood. Colonel Viktor Petrov had spent his career proving that transport pilots could accomplish extraordinary things when the situation demanded it, and he had passed that lesson to his granddaughter through stories of impossible missions flown under desperate circumstances. Now Ghost was continuing that tradition, using modern aircraft and contemporary techniques to demonstrate the same fundamental principle. that limitations existed primarily in the mind, and that skilled pilots could push their aircraft far beyond conventional boundaries when lives depended on their willingness to try. The test program at Edwards would continue for another 18 months, producing new training materials, operational procedures, and tactical doctrines that would influence transport aviation for decades to come. But Ghost's legacy had already been established through a single mission that had rewritten the rules of military aviation and demonstrated that heroism could emerge from the most unlikely sources. The final phase of the test program brought together pilots from allied nations who wanted to understand and potentially adopt the combat landing techniques that had emerged from Ghost's rescue mission. The International Military Aviation Exchange Program had drawn participants from 12 countries, each bringing their own aircraft and operational perspectives to Edwards Air Force Base. Ghost,